Relax and listen to the voice. Yesterday, I received an email from my ex-girlfriend, Becky. She got married last year. She said she needed help, and I was the only one that she could turn to. There was something wrong with her husband, John. He tidies everything up and arranges things in piles. It sounds stupid, I know, but he has become obsessed. The house is spotless. He cleans and disinfects everything. He has to arrange every single thing so that it's perfectly aligned. He put out all the books in the bookcase in alphabetical order and stacked the magazines on the coffee table so that they're perfectly aligned with the edge of the table. Whenever I ask him why he's doing all of this, he just avoids the question. One day I found him rummaging through the kitchen drawers, cleaning them out and making sure the cutlery was all perfectly aligned. He was also counting the cutlery obsessively and putting a certain number in each section of the drawer. When I demanded to know why he was doing all of this, he flew into a rage. Last night I woke up and John wasn't in bed. I heard him rummaging around downstairs. He was rifling through the bookcase, furiously pulling books out, rearranging them, counting them, and stacking them in piles. He was also whispering to himself, repeating numbers over and over. It was as if he had gone out of his mind. "What are you doing?" I shouted at him. "There are exactly 75 books on this bookcase," he replied. "That's 3 times 25, which is 3 times 5 times 5. It's like fives. Fives are what attracts it." I was shocked. "What likes fives?" "The long face," he hissed as he started sorting through the books again, ignoring me. I tried to stop him and calm him down, but he pushed me away and knocked me to the floor. "This bookcase needs 49 books," he whispered, very slowly and carefully. "Exactly 49. No more, no less. That's 7 times 7. It doesn't like sevens. It likes fives, okay? I'm gonna have to teach you." I was so scared, I ran out of the house. I'm scared to go back. I'm staying with a friend right now. Can you come over? I need to talk to you. I hope to see you soon. Becky. April 5th. When I went to see Becky, she threw her arms around me and hugged me tightly. Her eyes were red from crying. I comforted her as best as I could, and once she had calmed down, she asked if I would escort her back to her house. She wanted to check on her husband. When we got there, we found 7 neat piles of books stacked on the doorstep. I told her maybe I should go in first. I pushed the door open slowly and called out John's name, but there was no answer. The house was extremely tidy. Not a thing was out of place. There was something disturbing about it. It was as if nobody had even ever lived there. We searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of John. When I checked the bathroom, I found a trail of blood leading to the bath. John was lying in the tub in a pool of blood. He looked like he had possibly committed suicide. His wrists were slit. I almost threw up and I had to stop Becky from coming in. I didn't want her to see him like that. We called the police, and while we were waiting, I noticed something. John was clutching a small notebook in his hand. It looked like a diary. I don't know why, but when Becky wasn't looking, I took it. April 6th. I read John's diary, and it reads like the ravings of a lunatic. However, it does explain all the strange behaviors. The pages are filled with scrawled handwriting, all about something he calls the long face. He doesn't really explain what it is, but there are a list of rules for dealing with it. He says it likes multiples of 5 and will seek them out. It hates 7s. Everything must be arranged, sorted, and piled to correspond with these numbers and multiples of these numbers. It sounds insane. April 9th. I'm beginning to think the insanity is contagious. Something very strange happened to me today. I was looking at my bookcase and I happened to notice that there were 5 books on one of the shelves. It made me extremely uncomfortable, and I thought about the long face. I couldn't get it out of my head. I laughed at myself, but as I turned to leave, I saw a face. On a bag in the corner, I saw a face. The two handles looked like wild, staring eyes, and the zippered opening looked like a leering mouth. It may sound silly, but I rearranged the books so that there were 7 on each shelf. When I looked back at the bag, the face was gone. Becky's doing fine now. For the past couple of days, she's been staying with a friend. She doesn't want to go back to her own house. There's too many bad memories there. April 13th. I think I'm losing my mind. All this stuff about the long face is freaking me out. Everywhere I go, I keep seeing faces. I was walking down the street and a car was coming towards me. The headlights looked like eyes and the front of the grill looked like a mouth. When I look down at my cup of coffee, I can somehow make out little faces in the froth. I see faces in buildings, in objects, and even when I stare up at the clouds. I've also started to count things. At first it was books, then it was DVDs, cutlery, pens and pencils, even spare change sitting on the dresser. The things that I read in that diary are seeping into my mind and I can't stop thinking about them. Everything has to be in multiples of 7. If they aren't, or even worse, if I see a multiple of 5, the faces start appearing and each new face I see looks more and more angry than the last. Even as I type this, I can see a face in my computer. Maybe it's just my reflection, but I don't think so. Even looking at my computer, the speakers form the eyes and the keyboard is the mouth. I know it's all in my head, but I can't help it. I'm becoming obsessed. April 16th. It's getting worse. The house is too dirty. Everything's all over the place. I need to tidy it up. Everything here needs to be cleaned and disinfected. How can I stay safe if I don't tidy all this up? April 17th. When I was going to work today, I saw a face in the trees. It gave me such a scare. The branches were moving and it seemed as if the face was coming towards me. I almost lost control of my car and swerved off the road. I figured out how to stop it though. I started counting things. When I'm counting, it seems to get confused. I just have to keep counting things. It's the only way I'm going to keep it at bay. April 20th. Why did I read that wretched diary? The long faces everywhere. People can't see it because they don't know about it, but it's there. It's always there. They need to be trained to repel the long face. They need to know about it. I can't be the only one. April 22nd. I counted the pages in the diary. There are exactly 125. That's 5 times 5 times 5. Maybe that's what's attracting the long face. But what if I miscounted? What if there were only 126 pages? 126 is a multiple of 7. That would be good, but then I've already counted it 5 times. I'll count it 7 times to make sure. Maybe I should count it 77 times to really make sure. Yeah, that makes sense. April 27th. All of this needs to end here. I'm going to burn the diary. If no one can read about it, maybe this can all be contained. Maybe if nobody else finds out about whatever evil force is causing all of this, it'll come to an end. Forget that you ever read about any of this. Forget that you ever heard about the long face. But before you stop reading, let me give you one more last piece of advice. I think it's attracted by another number as well. There was a young girl named Alicia who moved with her parents to a new town. They rented a big old house that was sparsely furnished. Alicia slept in the downstairs bedroom while her parents slept upstairs. After they had been living there a few weeks, Alicia's parents noticed that she was growing very thin. As the days went on, her health seemed to get worse and worse. Then the poor girl came down with a mysterious illness and was confined to her bed. The doctor came to examine her, and he told her parents that she was suffering from anemia. All she needed was some rest, he said, and soon she would be as good as new. However, despite what the doctor said, Alicia's condition continued to get worse and worse. Her skin was gray and pallid, her cheeks were sunken, and there were dark circles around her eyes. Her parents were distraught and had no idea what to do. While Alicia slept in her bed, her mother and father paced back and forth restlessly, wondering what could be the cause of her mysterious illness. Day by day and hour by hour, the poor girl grew worse and worse. She was so weak she could barely move. Alicia was fading fast, and the life was ebbing from her veins. She was deathly pale and her body was shriveled and withered. She started to have hallucinations and began screaming out in terror and babbling incoherently in a weak voice. Finally, Alicia lost consciousness and died. Her parents were inconsolable. They held a funeral service and buried their beloved daughter in the town cemetery. The day after the funeral, Alicia's mother was stripping the sheets off of her daughter's bed when she noticed something on the pillow. There were 2 red stains in the white material. When she picked up the pillow, she noticed it was unusually heavy, so she called her husband to come and take a look at it. As the parents examined the pillow closely, the mother suddenly let out a scream. She felt something moving inside of it. The father fetched a knife and slit open the pillow, emptying the feathers out onto the floor. As the parents watched in horror, something crawled out of the pile of feathers, slowly moving its hairy legs. It was a monstrous black spider, so swollen with blood that they could scarcely make out its mouth. Night after night, as Alicia lay in bed, this hairy abomination had been stealthily sucking all the blood from her body and slowly draining her life away. Bernard Sloan had the perfect family. They were always there, waiting for him when he finished work. Every evening at 7 o'clock, he put out the lights, locked the front door, and went downstairs to the basement to spend the evening with his family. His wife Jenny would be sitting on the couch, knitting a sweater. His mother was always dozing in her easy chair. His son Ben and his daughter Emma were usually sitting at the table, playing a board game. Little Luke lay on the floor, playing with his toys, while little Martha, the youngest, sat at the piano. Bernard would sit down in his big comfortable chair and chat with them until bedtime. He told them all about his day and who had died recently in town. He would repeat funny stories and jokes he heard and tell them his views and opinions on any subject that came to mind. They always listened patiently and never argued or contradicted him. When it was time to go to bed, Bernard would yawn and stretch his arms. He would go around giving them all a kiss on the cheek and saying, "Well, good night, everyone. Pleasant dreams." And then he would turn out the lights, climb the stairs, and lock the door behind him when he went to bed. Middleton was a small town, and Bernard was the only undertaker in the area. His funeral parlor was also his home, and he got all the business there was. Although he didn't have any close friends, he was well known, respected, and above suspicion. Everything went like clockwork. People would bring their dead loved ones to him, and Bernard would embalm their bodies and prepare them for burial. The funeral was usually held in the local church, and the dead were buried in a local graveyard. One day, as Bernard was cleaning up the funeral parlor, a policeman came to the front door. "Can I help you, officer?" Bernard asked. "I'm here about the Periwinkle child," the policeman said. Bernard had a puzzled frown on his face. "The Periwinkle child?" "Martha Periwinkle," said the policeman. "The little girl who drowned 5 months ago." "Oh, yes, of course," said Bernard. "I remember now." "Well, I'll level with you, Mr. Sloan. The family had her body exhumed. When they opened the coffin, they got quite a shock. There was nothing but stacks of old newspaper inside of it." "Oh my God," said Bernard. "How terrible." "Now look, Mr. Sloan," the policeman said. Theft of a dead body is a criminal offense. If you cooperate, we'll go easy on you. The family just wants their daughter's remains so they can give her a proper burial." Bernard was highly offended. "I've been in business in Middleton for 20 years, he said. "Everybody knows me. How could you think I would do such a thing?" "Well, then you won't mind if I search your house, correct?" the policeman said. Bernard's face suddenly turned pale. "Well, I certainly do mind," he said. "This is my home as well as my place of business. I know my rights as a citizen. I'm not going to have anybody snooping through my private property without a search warrant." "If that's the way you want to do it, that's fine by me," the policeman growled. "I'll be back in an hour with the search warrant. In the meantime, I'll leave an officer outside to make sure you don't try to get rid of any evidence." Bernard watched as the policeman turned and left. He shut the front door and stood there thinking for a few minutes. Then he went downstairs to the basement to see his family. He opened the curtains and let some light into the room for the first time. His wife was still knitting. His mother was still dozing on the couch. Ben and Emma were still playing their board game. Luke was still playing with his toys, and Martha was still at the piano. Somehow they all seemed a little withered, less like living people and more like mummies. Only Martha, the new girl, looked as fresh as she had been on the day she drowned. Bernard let out a deep sigh. He picked up a container of gasoline and began splashing it around the basement room. He splashed it all over his wife, his mother, and each one of his children. Then he kissed them all on the forehead and sat down in his chair. He loved them all so much, and he couldn't bear to see his family torn apart. He reached into his pocket and took out a box of matches. He selected one match, struck it, and the entire room burst into flames. "Pleasant dreams, everybody!" he screamed as the fire engulfed him. "Pleasant dreams!" There was a 19-year-old Korean girl named Haruko who was attending university in a large city. One night, she had to stay late in the library to finish a project, and it was almost dark by the time she returned home. Haruko lived on the 14th floor of an old apartment building. She stood in the entrance and pressed the button to call the elevator. She always hated coming home alone so late in the evening. It just didn't feel safe to her. When the elevator came, she stepped inside and pushed the button for her floor. Just as the doors were about to close, a handsome man came running up. The man was out of breath and put out his hand to stop the doors from closing. Then he stepped into the elevator and stood beside her. "You live on the 14th floor?" he asked, seeing the button lit up. "Yes," replied Haruko. "Oh," said the man, smiling. "I live on the 13th floor." As the elevator ascended, he pressed the button for floor 13. Through the windows in the elevator door, Haruko watched the floors go by, as they both stood in silence. She stole a few glances of the man. He certainly was handsome. She wondered if he would ever be interested in dating her. When he happened to look at her, she batted her eyelids and smiled sweetly at him. Just then, the elevator stopped at the 13th floor. The doors opened and the man stepped out. "I'll see you later," he said. "Yes, see you," replied Haruko. As the doors of the elevator were closing behind him, the man suddenly turned around, pulled a sharp knife out of his jacket and said, in a menacing voice, "I'll see you later, upstairs." Then, laughing like a maniac, he ran towards the staircase. The girl was confused and also terrified, but before she could do a thing, the door shut and the elevator began to ascend. She began to panic. Desperately, she hammered the buttons with her fist, trying to get the elevator to stop, but it was no use. When the elevator reached the 14th floor and the doors opened, the man with the knife was already standing there, waiting for her. In Korea, people say that this is a true story. The girl was found dead, stabbed to death in the elevator. People say that the worst part was not her death itself, but rather the sheer horror she experienced in between those two floors when she was trapped in the elevator and knew that she was going to die. They claim that this is the reason that all the elevators in Korea now have a stop button. It had a big head and its face was made of wrinkled, flesh-colored rubber. The eyes were gigantic, bulging white orbs, and its black hair was made of some hard substance that didn't quite mesh with the rubbery head. The teeth were gigantic, pure white, and capable of moving up and down. The body and limbs were wooden, painted to resemble clothes, but the paint was faded so you could see the wood's natural brown in some places. Each arm and leg was a different length, but the hands and feet were pretty detailed. It made a loud clattering sound whenever it moved. That puppet has always followed me. I don't mean that it got up and chased me around the room or anything. I just mean that it kept showing up in my life. My earliest memory of it is from my first birthday. Although I obviously can't recall much of that day, I do remember that horrible puppet. I have no idea why it was there. I just remember that it scared me to death and I couldn't stop crying. A few years later, when I was finally able to talk, I asked my parents about it, and they flatly denied anything like that had ever happened on my first birthday. They must have thought lying about it would make things easier for me. The next time I saw it was when I was 3 years of age. I was exploring a room filled with old stuff my parents had stored away, and I found a calendar. I don't remember the year, but there was a photo for each month. The only one I remember was October. That puppet was the image for it. I got scared and I ran out of the room. I told my mom and I tried to show her the calendar so that she would know that the puppet was real, but I couldn't find it. The room had been really messy, and I ran out of it so quickly that I knocked over piles of stuff. I guess the calendar got buried under that stuff. It happened again when I was 6 years old. In the middle of the night, I woke up from a nightmare. I was too scared to go back to sleep, so I went down to the living room and turned on the TV. An old black and white TV show was just ending, and when the commercial started, the puppet came on the screen. It was dancing while loud music played in the background. I screamed and started crying uncontrollably, but by the time my parents got downstairs, the show was off and the puppet was gone. After that, I didn't see the puppet again for quite a while, but I kept having nightmares about it. When I was 15, I decided to try to track it down, using the internet to try to find information about the calendar, the commercial, or anything else. No one had ever heard of it, but one day I got an instant message from someone I'd never talked to before. The person's screen name was a random mashup of numbers and letters, but their avatar was a picture of the puppet. "Glad that you still remember me," they said, and then immediately signed off. They never contacted me or came back online again, as far as I'm aware. When I was 20 years old, I was walking past a store that sold old toys and dolls, and in the front window, I saw the puppet. I went inside and asked the clerk if he knew anything about the puppet's history, when it was made, where it was from, or anything like that. The only thing he could tell me was that the puppet had just been sold to the store a few days before. He told me I could have it for $6. I wasn't sure what to do. It still scared me, but having proof that it really existed seemed like a good idea. So I bought the puppet and I took it home. For a while I felt better. I regarded the puppet as an irrational childhood fear that as an adult I had managed to overcome. I even started to believe the explanations my parents had tried to give me. They said I must have seen it somewhere as a baby and the image just became lodged in my subconscious. I must have imagined it in the calendar, they said. Perhaps I was dreaming when I saw it on the TV commercial. After all, I had just woken up. Maybe the person who contacted me online had just been playing a practical joke. I kept the puppet, but as I moved on in my life, I pretty much forgot about it. I finished college, I settled down, and I got married. My wife will be giving birth in a few weeks. I was cleaning up the spare room and preparing it for when the baby comes when I found the puppet in the back of the wardrobe, dusty and abandoned. I didn't want to leave it in my child's bedroom, so I picked it up and I moved it to another place. As I was dusting it off, I noticed a faded inscription on the back of it. It read, "This is what he will look like." Before I could figure out what this meant, I heard my wife crying downstairs. I rushed down the stairs and to her side, and she looked more upset than I had ever seen her before. Sobbing, she told me that the doctor had just called. Apparently, there was a problem with the baby. It seemed to be horribly disfigured. One morning at breakfast, my wife seemed very tired. Her face was pale and sweaty. When she reached out to pick up her cup of coffee, I noticed that her hand was shaking. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Did you get enough sleep last night?" "I don't know," she replied. "I'm not sure if I was sleeping or if I was awake. Have you ever had a dream that felt so real that you weren't sure if it was actually a dream?" She paused for a long time before continuing. "Last night I had one of those dreams," she said. "In the dream, I woke up in a cold sweat. My heart was racing and I was breathing heavily. I went to the bathroom to get a drink of water, but something didn't feel right. I looked up and I saw that the ceiling wasn't there anymore. Instead, it was as if I was looking up out of a grave. I could see the edges of the grave above me. There were people gathered around the graveside, but I didn't recognize any of them except for one woman. She looked exactly like me. Same eyes, same nose, same face, same everything. She bent over the grave and peered down at me. A broad smile spread across her face and she said, 'You've lived long enough. Time to let someone else live for a while.' I went back to the bedroom and I lay down in bed, and I can't remember if I lay awake or if I fell asleep. The next morning when my wife came down for breakfast, she looked even worse. Her hair was disheveled and her brow was dripping with sweat. 'I had the same dream again,' she said, her voice shaking. She couldn't say anything more, but as she left for work and kissed me goodbye, I could see the fear in her eyes. I began to get very worried. My wife always seemed to be very calm and relaxed. Now it seemed as if she was turning into a nervous wreck. Every night for the rest of the week, she had the same dream. Each morning before she left for work, she would tell me about the dream. Her face grew gray, her eyes became haunted, and she began looking gaunt and sickly. I decided that it was time for her to go and see a psychologist, or just a regular doctor. However, on Saturday morning, she woke up much later than usual, and when she came down for breakfast, she looked as if the extra sleep had done her some good. She appeared to be healthy and vigorous again. "Did you have that dream again last night?" I asked. She looked up at me. A broad smile spread across her face, and she said, "What dream? I have no idea what you're talking about, but boy do I feel alive." A collection of ghost stories. "How eerie," said the girl, advancing cautiously. "And what a heavy door." She touched it as she spoke, and it suddenly swung to with a click. "Good Lord," said the man. "I don't believe there's a handle inside. Why, you've locked us both in." "Not both of us, only one of us," said the girl. And before his eyes she passed straight through the door and vanished. A father and son moved into a new house. One day, the father saw the son was looking oddly pale. "What's wrong, son?" he asked. "Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" "Of course not," said the father. "Ghosts don't exist." "But Dad," the son replied, Our maid said that there's a ghost in the house. Son, pack your bags. We're leaving, the father said. Why, Dad? The father then replied, Son, we don't have a maid. One night there was a young man riding on horseback. He was tired and hungry and looking for a place to spend the night. He saw a little villa up ahead where he might ask for shelter. He rode into the courtyard and got off of his horse. There he saw a beautiful young woman who was holding a candle. She asked him who he was and what he wanted. Describing his situation, the young man asked her for shelter. The lady agreed and she led him inside. The young man looked around the house and saw a painting of a dreadful, evil-looking man. He asked the woman who the person was. She replied that it was her husband who had died a few years ago. The young man examined the picture closely. When he turned around, he was frightened to see the very same man standing there, staring at him with a horrible expression on his face. The husband shouted at the young man and demanded to know what he was doing in his house. The young man replied that the woman had invited him inside. The husband said that that was impossible. His wife had died 2 years ago. This was a very horrifying situation for the young man, but suddenly he saw the woman walking towards him. He told the husband to look behind him, but the husband said he couldn't see her. Then both the husband and wife started laughing. They explained that it had all just been a prank that they were playing. Just then, a servant came out into the room. He told the husband and wife that there was a dead body outside in the courtyard. The husband and wife rushed out of the villa and were horrified to see the body of the young man lying dead on the back of his horse. A young man had been sent in to inspect the forests in a remote mountain region. He was staying at an inn that was owned by a husband and wife. The wife was bewitchingly attractive, with long dark hair and beautiful brown eyes. The husband was a large, burly, fat man who seldom spoke. As the weeks went by, a strange mutual attraction grew between the young man and the innkeeper's wife. The husband spent his evenings drinking himself into a stupor. He would often pass out drunk, leaving the young man and the wife alone together. One day, the husband was called away to visit his sick mother in the next village. Finding himself alone again with the innkeeper's wife, the young man suggested they go for a walk in the forest. She readily agreed to this. While they were out walking, they came upon a cave, and a meaningful look passed between both of them. Without a word, they entered the cave, and within seconds they were in each other's arms, locked in a passionate embrace. Suddenly the cave was plunged into total darkness. A massive stone had been rolled over to block the entrance. It seemed that they were trapped inside. Outside, they heard the sound of retreating footsteps, and they heard the husband's evil laughter. A romantically tragic end to their passion? Not really. The woman was slim enough to slip through a narrow crack between the cave entrance and the stone. The young man was not so lucky. How do I know this? Well, I'd rather not say, but my wife sees the ghost of a young man every night outside her window, and her hair is all white now. A few years ago, an old lady died in her house. Since then, a lot of people claim to see her ghost wandering around at night inside of the house. One night, a couple went to explore the house to see if the rumor was true. "Do you think she'll come out tonight?" the girl asked. "I don't know. We'll have to see," replied the guy. "Don't be scared. It's just a rumor, you know." Cautiously, the couple forced the door open and stepped inside. As soon as they walked in, the door shut behind them with a loud bang. "I'm scared. Let's get out of here," cried the girl. The guy slowly turned to face her, and with a cold smile he said, "Where are you going? You haven't even met my mother yet." An old man was out walking one night. He took a shortcut through the graveyard and spotted a ghostly figure standing among the headstones. The figure beckoned to him, and trembling with fear, the old man approached. The ghostly figure was pointing to one grave in particular that was neglected and covered with weeds. As the man drew nearer to the grave that the ghost was pointing at, the old man was able to make out the inscription on the headstone. It was his own name. A man was sitting next to an attractive young woman on a train. The woman took out a book and began to read. The train stopped at many stations, but she never looked up once. The man watched her for a while, and then he asked, "Hey, miss, what are you reading?" "A ghost story," she replied. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked. "Yes, I do," she replied. "There are ghosts everywhere." "I don't believe in them," said the man. "It's just a lot of superstition. In all my years, I've never seen a ghost. Not one." "Oh, really? Haven't you?" asked the woman, as she slowly started to vanish. Years ago in South Korea, there was a mother who had a cute 5-year-old daughter named Ji-yoon. The little girl was very vain and had a habit of constantly asking her mother if she was pretty. "Of course you're pretty," the mother always replied, even though she was tired of answering the same question. One day, the mother took her daughter for a walk down by the river. As they were crossing the bridge, Ji-yoon stared down into the rushing water and asked her mother, "Mommy, am I pretty?" The mother was so fed up and annoyed with answering the same question over and over that she lost her temper. In a blind rage, she pushed her own daughter into the river. Ji-yoon fell into the water with a splash. The little girl was unable to swim, and within moments, she sank below the surface and drowned. Realizing what she had done, the mother was overcome with anguish. However, she didn't want to go to jail, so she told the police that Ji-yoon had slipped and fallen over the edge. Her friends and neighbors came to comfort her, and before long, the woman forgot about her daughter and went on with her life. A few years later, she became pregnant again and gave birth to another child, who she named Ji-eun to commemorate her deceased daughter. One day, the mother found the little girl standing in front of the mirror and staring at her own reflection. "Mommy, do you think I'm pretty?" asked Ji-eun. "Of course you're pretty," replied the mother. The little girl looked up at her mother and asked, "If you thought I was so pretty, then why did you push me into the river?" Last night I was returning home on the last train. My house is in the countryside and I was the only one in the train car. The motion of the train was making me sleepy, and I still had quite a few stations to wait until it came to my stop. I began to doze off and I could hear the soothing sound of the ocean as my eyes closed. I noticed it was awfully cold in the train carriage and I was just about to fall asleep when it hit me. Why could I hear the sound of the ocean? Suddenly, I opened my eyes and I looked around. The carriage was completely empty. Where was the noise coming from? Then I looked up. On the luggage rack above me, I saw something. Somebody was lying there. It was a pale man with cracked skin and unkempt hair. He had an unsettling grin on his face and he was staring down at me through the slats on the luggage rack. His mouth was moving. The sound that I was hearing wasn't the ocean. It was the sound of the man whispering. Our eyes met and I was so scared that I found it impossible to look away. In that moment, it was as if I'd forgotten how to move my eyes and I couldn't break eye contact with him. My heart was beating fast and I was in a panic. His mouth just kept moving, making those whooshing sounds like waves crashing against rocks. His yellowed eyes just stared directly into mine. Just when I thought I was about to go insane, the train arrived at my station. They called out my location name, and I jumped out of my seat and practically rolled out through the door and onto the platform. As the train pulled away, I could see him still staring at me. I was terrified and hurried back to my house. Even when I closed the door behind me and locked it tightly, I still couldn't relax. In the middle of the night, I woke up and I heard something. The noise seemed to be coming from downstairs. My heart almost stopped. I was too frightened to go downstairs and see what was making the sound. It was the soothing sound of the ocean. There was a teenage girl who wanted to go to a disco for the first time in her life. She asked her parents for permission, but they said that she was too young. When she argued with them, they refused to listen and they sent her to her room. The girl was angry and decided to sneak out of the house. She really wanted to go to the nightclub. She took some pillows and put them under the blankets on her bed, so it looked as if someone were sleeping there. Then she got dressed up, put on some makeup, and slowly opened her bedroom door. She could hear her parents talking in the kitchen, so she quietly tiptoed down the stairs and made her way out of the front door. When she got home later that night, she climbed in through her bedroom window and found that her bed had been disturbed. The blankets were crumpled and there was a hole in the sheets. There was also a hole in one of the pillows. In the morning when she came down for breakfast, she didn't say anything to her parents, but they were looking at her strangely. In the evening, her parents went out for dinner. The girl wanted to call one of her friends, but she had run out of credit. She went out to the local shop and topped up her mobile phone. It was getting dark, and on her way back, she had to walk through a park. She was going down a deserted path when all of a sudden, a masked man jumped out of the bushes and tried to attack her. He had a long iron bar in his hand and he swung it at her head. She managed to dodge the blow, just in time, and the iron bar whizzed past her ear. The girl immediately fled before the masked man could catch her. She ran as fast as she could, not daring to even look back until she arrived at her front door. The girl's parents came home a few minutes later, and the terrified girl told them what had happened. They scolded her for walking through the park on her own in the dark, and told her to be more careful in the future. They were still giving her the same strange look that they had given her in the morning. The parents told their daughter to take a warm bath to relax and to calm her nerves. The girl undressed and got into the bath. She shut her eyes and tried to forget about the disturbing events of the day. Suddenly the door opened and her mother came rushing in with a toaster. Before the girl had a chance to react, her mother tried to throw the toaster into the bathtub. However, the woman misjudged the length of the wire and the toaster couldn't reach that far. The wire stopped it short and it dropped harmlessly on the bathroom floor. The girl had narrowly escaped being killed by an electric shock. Jumping out of the bathtub, the girl started screaming at her mother. In that moment, she realized that they had been trying to kill her. Grabbing her mobile phone, she told them that she would call the police unless they told her why they wanted her dead. Her mother burst into tears just as her father came running into the bathroom and hung his head in shame. The parents sat down on the edge of the bathtub and tried to explain. It turned out that the girl's uncle, her father's brother, was terminally ill in the hospital. He was a successful businessman and had amassed a huge fortune during his long career. He had no children, so when he drew up his will, he decided to leave all of his wealth to his favorite niece. When the uncle died, the teenage girl would receive over $1 million. If she died, then the money would automatically go to her parents. The girl couldn't believe what her parents were telling her. She realized that the pair were incredibly greedy and soulless. Infanticide was the worst crime that a parent could commit. She struggled to understand how her parents could be so low as to try to murder their own daughter for money. It was a betrayal that could never be forgiven. The girl immediately packed her belongings and left the house that very night. She booked into a cheap hotel and decided to cut off all communication with her parents. Despite the many difficulties she faced, she tried to make a life for herself alone. She got a job and she earned enough money to put herself through university. Although she was very busy, she set aside some time each week to visit her uncle in the hospital. In her first year of university, she met a guy in her class who seemed very nice. He wasn't very good looking, but he had an attractive personality. He was kind and gentle and always made sure that he was there for her in her times of trouble. When she was in his arms, she felt safe and protected. Finally, she had found someone in her life who she could trust. A few months passed, and the happy couple decided to get married. They had a modest wedding in a local church and invited all their friends to celebrate the joyous occasion with them. The girl insisted that they not invite her parents to the wedding. When the guy asked her about it, she told them how they had betrayed her. The day after the wedding, the newlyweds went on their honeymoon. They booked a short holiday at a scenic resort in the mountains next to a shimmering lake. When they arrived, the location looked so beautiful that they decided to take a boat trip on the lake and take the view in. It was autumn and the leaves were falling from the trees. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the skies, and the resort was almost deserted. When they rowed out to the center of the lake, the husband got up and grabbed his wife. He pushed her over the side of the boat, and she tumbled into the icy water with a splash. He then grabbed an oar and began beating her over the head with it as she struggled to stay afloat. Eventually, he knocked her unconscious, and she sank beneath the waves. After that, he rowed back into the shore and called the police, tearfully recounting how his wife had accidentally fallen overboard and drowned. A few days later, the girl's uncle was found dead in his hospital bed. He'd been smothered with a pillow. Within a few months, the girl's husband received the millions of dollars in inheritance, and as planned, he split the fortune with the parents. A little girl opened the door to her parents' bedroom in the middle of the night. "Daddy, I had a bad dream," she said. Her father blinked his eyes and sat up in bed, leaning on his elbows. The digital alarm clock glowed red in the darkness. It was 3:33 a.m. "Do you want to climb in bed and tell me about it?" the father asked. "No, Daddy," came the reply from the girl. The oddness of the situation made him wake up more fully. He could barely make out his daughter's pale form, outlined in the light from the doorway. Why not, sweetie?" he asked. The little girl began to cry. "Because in my dream, when I told you about the dream, the thing wearing Mommy's skin sat up." For a moment, the father felt paralyzed, unable to take his eyes off of his daughter, and then he felt the covers next to him slowly beginning to shift. It was the middle of winter. The wind was blowing cold and the sidewalks were covered in snow. A businessman had just finished work and was leaving his office. As he walked out the door of the building, he saw a young boy sitting on the side of the street. He was dressed in faded shorts and a frayed shirt, and he was shivering in the cold. "Hey, mister, give me 1 penny," shouted the boy. "Leave me alone," bellowed the man, as he quickly got into his car and drove off. The businessman had carved out a successful career for himself in the finance industry. He had a lot of money in the bank and he owned a big house. Despite all of this, he never gave so much as 1 cent to the poor. Whenever people asked him why he didn't give to charity, he just told them that he wasn't in the business of paying people to be lazy. Later that evening, when he got home from work, The businessman pulled into his driveway and was shocked to see the young boy standing at his front door. "Hey, mister, give me 1 penny," said the boy. Without a second thought, the businessman roughly pushed the boy aside and entered his house. He sat down in his living room and turned on the television. His wife came in carrying a tray and placed his dinner in front of him. As he was eating, he happened to look out the window and saw the boy standing there, clutching himself and trying to keep warm in the freezing weather. The man let out an exasperated sigh, and then got up and pulled the curtains closed. The next morning when he was leaving for work, the boy was still there. "Hey, mister, can you give me 1 penny?" said the boy. The irritated man ignored him and got into his car. His wheels spun in the snow, showering the boy with sleet and ice as he drove off. That evening when he returned, the young boy was there waiting for him. The man was fed up and dug deeply into his pocket. He took out a copper coin and threw it angrily at the boy. "There's your damn penny," he shouted. "Now get out of my sight." The boy picked up the money and left without saying a word. After work, the man walked out of his office, expecting to see the boy, but the street was empty. He drove home, expecting to find the boy waiting for him, but there was nobody in his driveway. He walked into his house, kissed his wife, ate some dinner, and watched some television. The boy seemed to be leaving him alone. In the middle of the night, the businessman was lying in bed with his wife when he felt a cold little hand on his shoulder touching him. He heard a voice whisper in his ear, "Hey, mister, give me just 1 penny?" The man screamed in fright and jumped out of bed, but when he switched on the lights, there was no one else in the room other than he and his wife. His wife calmed him down and told him he must have just been dreaming. He lay back down and tried to sleep, but spent most of the night tossing and turning, unable to do so. He began to remember something, an incident that had happened many years ago. When he was still a young boy, he and his gang of friends had been the school bullies. All of the kids had been afraid of them. There was one little boy in particular that he had bullied every day. The boy's parents were very poor and couldn't afford to buy him new clothes. He recalled how he had often teased the poor child, and at other times he had beaten him up and stolen his pocket money. The businessman's memory was foggy. As morning approached, he climbed up into the attic and dug out his old school yearbooks. Flipping through the pages, he found a picture of the young boy he had bullied mercilessly. The yearbook dropped from his hands. It looked exactly like the same young boy that had been visiting him. Gradually, his memories began to grow more clear. He recalled the day that he and 3 of his friends had dragged the poor boy down to the local river. After beating him up, they threw him into the icy waters and walked away without giving him a second thought. The next day, the poor boy didn't turn up in class. He and his friends simply assumed that the boy's parents had moved him to another school. The man didn't sleep at all that night. At breakfast, he didn't eat a thing. He had completely lost his appetite thinking of what he had done. Cautiously, he opened the front door and he saw the little boy waiting outside in the snow. The man could barely breathe. It seemed as if the boy's piercing eyes were staring into his soul. The man fell on his knees and begged the boy for forgiveness. "What do you want from me?" he cried. "It was so long ago. We were children. There were other people involved. I wasn't the only one. It wasn't just my fault." The boy just stood still and stared at him. The man took a wad of bills out of his pocket and thrust them at the boy. "Here, take this," he said. "It's all the money I have in my wallet." The boy took the money from the man's trembling hands and disappeared without saying a single word. That evening, the man came home and he ate his dinner. He had regained his appetite and he felt much better. His conscience was clear. During the night, he woke up feeling thirsty and he went downstairs to get himself a drink. He stopped cold in the doorway of the kitchen. In the pale moonlight, he could just make out a small figure lurking in the darkness. A voice whispered, "Give me 1 penny." The terrified man ran out of the house and jumped into his car. He drove to the nearest bank and he waited until it opened. At that point, he took out all of his life savings. He sold his house with all the furniture inside. He sold his car, his television, and even his wife's jewelry. He put all the money in a bag, every single penny of it. Later that day, as he was walking down the street, the boy stepped out of an alleyway and stood in front of him. "Hey, mister, give me 1 penny," said the boy. The weary man laid the bag of money at the boy's feet. "This is every penny I have," he said. "Take it and leave me alone." The boy picked up the bag and disappeared without saying a word. The next night, the man was lying in a doorway, struggling to keep warm. He was dressed in an old pair of pants and a frayed shirt. Around him, he was clutching a dirty blanket, trying desperately to fall asleep. Suddenly, he heard soft footsteps approaching in the darkness. They came to a stop right beside him. The man slowly turned and looked up. He saw the boy standing over him. "What do you want?" screamed the man. "I gave you everything, everything. There's nothing left to give. That's all I have." The ghost boy smiled and said, "No, mister, that's not all." He reached out, grabbed the old man's hand, and led him to the nearest river. He walked him into the water, went to the middle of the river, and sat with the old man until the old man stopped breathing. There was a young Russian girl who lived with her parents in a small house in the countryside. There were no other children living in the remote area, so she mostly spent her time playing alone in the fields. Their neighbor was a fat man of 50 years of age who raised pigs on a small farm. She was disgusted by the constant smell of manure that came from his farm and the never-ending oinking of his pigs. Whenever she played in the fields, she would notice him standing at his fence and staring at her intently. The strange way he looked at her always gave her the creeps. One night, as she was about to fall asleep, she heard a strange scratching at her bedroom window. She sat up in bed and switched on the lamp on her bedside table. The curtains suddenly parted and she screamed in horror. There was a huge, fat pig climbing in her bedroom window. Its hooves were scratching and scrabbling at the windowsill as it tried to pull itself up. She cried out for her parents as the pig struggled through the window and tumbled to the floor. It began squealing and jumped up onto her bed. The pig's dirty hooves pinned her to the mattress and it started gnawing at her face and slobbering all over her. The terrified girl fought desperately to keep the pig from biting off her nose. Her face was covered in drool and blood. Just then, her father rushed into the room, brandishing an axe. When he saw the enormous pig on top of his daughter, he let out a loud yell and began attacking it. The fat pig squealed and raced around the room. It lunged at the girl's father and knocked him to the floor with all of its weight. The axe flew out of his hands. He managed to grab hold of the pig's snout and poke it in the eyes. The pig finally retreated and began scrambling out the window just as it had come in. Just when it was about to get away, her father swung the axe and it stuck in the pig's back. The monstrous animal let out a piercing squeal of pain as it escaped into the night. The next morning, their neighbor was found dead in the woods. All of the people in the area were mystified. The man had bled to death. When they found him, his corpse was completely naked and there was an axe embedded into his back. For a tired child, bedtime is always a happy and relaxing event when they relax and drift off into a restful slumber. Some children complain when their parents force them to go to sleep before their bedtime. For me, bedtime was always a fearful and terrifying event that I dreaded every night. My fear of sleeping began when I was 8 years old. My parents moved me into my own bedroom, a small and narrow room at the back of the house, just large enough for a bunk bed and a chest of drawers. It only had one window which looked out onto the back garden, and it didn't let in much light. It was the first time I had ever slept on my own, and from the very first night, I remember experiencing a strange feeling of unease. As I lay there on the top bunk, trying to fall asleep, I thought I heard a noise. I couldn't be sure, but it seemed to be coming from the bottom bunk. The room was pitch black, and the curtains on the window let in just enough light to make out the vague shapes in the dark. At first, I wasn't sure what the noise was. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. I listened closely and realized that it was the unmistakable sound of bed sheets rustling in the dark. The bottom bunk was empty, but when I peered over the edge of my bed, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Something suddenly withdrew out of sight into the bottom bunk, something that didn't want to be seen. I lay there in disbelief, trying to convince myself that it was just my fevered imagination running wild. I turned to face the wall and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep as quickly as possible. The rustling noise beneath me steadily increased until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was lurking in the bottom bunk began to toss and turn violently. Fear gripped my heart, and I had a terrible sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. My pulse was racing, and I broke out into a cold sweat. I could hear the sheets thrashing back and forth below. Eventually, I couldn't take the tension anymore, and I cried out for my mother. Suddenly, the bunk bed below began to shake violently, clattering against the wall. The bed sheets below me were still twisting and turning. I couldn't get out of bed in case the thing in the bottom bunk reached out and grabbed me. I imagined it pulling me by the ankle and dragging me off into the darkness. I just sat there, trapped in the top bunk, like a cornered rat, unable to flee. I clutched the blanket until my knuckles went white, and I waited. The door finally burst open, and my mother came in to calm me down. Tears were streaming down my face at that point. She lay down in the empty bunk and promised to stay there until morning. Eventually, I was able to fall asleep. The next day, as I played in the backyard, I kept glancing up at my bedroom window. Each time, a chill ran down my spine and my hair stood on end. I felt like something was lurking in that room, watching me play and waiting for night to fall so it could be alone with me again. I tried to tell my parents about it, but they wouldn't listen to me. They just dismissed my claims as childish fears of the dark, and when night arrived, they ushered me upstairs and forced me to get into the bed. "Go to sleep," said my mother. "Stop being such a baby. You're a big kid now." I didn't protest much. It was no use. I resigned myself to my fate. I climbed up to the top bunk, got under the covers, and waited. Lying there in the darkness, alone and frightened, I heard the quiet rustling of bed sheets, and I knew it was starting again. But this time, it was different. I heard the sound of slow, rasping breathing coming from the bottom bunk. The soft, labored wheezing made me shudder. Only a flimsy mattress separated me from whatever it was that was lurking below. Lying there paralyzed with fear, I just wanted the thing to leave me alone. Its labored breathing became louder and louder. Then suddenly, I felt something long and thin poking at the underside of my mattress. I screamed in horror, and the bunk bed began shaking violently again. My mother came rushing in and calmed me down with a comforting hug. Eventually, once again, my terror subsided, and with her standing guard, I was able to fall into an uneasy sleep. This continued for weeks. Night after night, I would wake up to the sound of rustling sheets or rasping breath. Each time, I would scream for help, and the bed would begin to shake violently. As soon as my mother came in, everything would stop, and she would have to spend the rest of the night in the bottom bunk, just so I could go to sleep. It was a difficult time for my family. My grandmother was sick, and my mother had to go and take care of her. When I found out that my mother would be away for the whole weekend, I flew into an absolute panic. There would be nobody to protect me from the thing in the bottom bunk. No one would answer my cries in the middle of the night. On the day my mother left, I rushed home after school and immediately stripped the bed sheets and mattress off the lower bunk and removed all of the slats. My plan was to prevent that thing from having a place to sleep for the night. I hoped that somehow this would protect me. Unfortunately, that night proved to be the most terrifying experience of all. To this day, I shudder to think about it. I managed to fall asleep, but in the middle of the night, something woke me up. The room was pitch black and there was no noise. No rustling of sheets, no raspy breathing, no movement at all. However, something just didn't feel right. Just then, I felt the covers on my bed begin to move. The horrifying truth suddenly dawned on me. The wretched thing that had terrorized me night after night was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth and I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My eyes were wide with terror and I lay motionless, barely able to breathe. I didn't want to let it know I was awake. I could feel it lying beside me, something cold and slimy leaning against my right arm. It was lying under the blanket. I could see its outline out of the corner of my eyes, but I didn't dare to look. All of a sudden, it rolled over on top of me, and I felt its weight pressing down on me. I will never forget that awful feeling. Hours passed and I lay there motionless, in the darkness, too frightened to move a muscle. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. Finally, I'd reached my breaking point, and I couldn't bear it even a moment longer. Ever so slowly, I tried to ease myself out from under it. Inch by painstaking inch, I shifted my weight, moving sideways. Just as I felt like I was about to escape, the thing moved. Dear God, it moved. I remember it moving. I felt a clammy hand reach across my chest and close around my throat. Its grip gradually tightened and I felt it squeezing my neck. The horrid, slimy thing began writhing and contorting under the blanket. I could hear it wheezing and rasping and coughing. I felt its breath against my face, foul-smelling and cold as ice. Dawn was just about to break, and the first rays of sunshine were peeking through the curtains. I fought for dear life, but I was no match for the thing. As its scrawny fingers squeezed my neck, I felt the life ebbing from me. I tried to scream, but the thing's grip was too tight. I was fighting to stay conscious when suddenly it released me and slowly withdrew, melting slowly into the wall. I tumbled down off the bed and scrambled out of the bedroom. When I got downstairs, I breathed a sigh of relief as I sat there coughing and choking. I'd survived the most horrible experience of my life. To this day, I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bed sheets rustling in the night. I spent the entire day trying to convince my father to spend the night in my room. It took some effort, but he finally agreed. Perhaps he was just trying to humor me while my mother was away. Whatever the reason, it proved to be a smart move because in one night, it solved the problem for good. Before I fell asleep, I kissed my father and I thanked him. The next morning, as I awoke, there was a din of noise and slamming. It sounded like things were breaking. Almost sounded like we were experiencing a tornado. When my father came into my room, I asked him if he slept well and thanked him for sleeping in my room that night. He gave me a cold, scared look, picked me up, told me that he had slept on the sofa, and we ran out of the house. Jimmy and his parents had just moved to a new house in the suburbs. Jimmy was eager to move into his own room. He picked the bedroom with the big window that looked out into the garden. The family quickly got their stuff moved in, and they went to bed. The first night that Jimmy slept in the room, something very strange happened. In the middle of the night, Jimmy was awoken by strange moans and screams. They seemed to be coming from outside. Jimmy shouted for his parents, and a few seconds later, they burst into his room. "What's wrong?" asked his father anxiously. "There's something in the garden!" Jimmy exclaimed. His parents checked and found nothing. They reassured Jimmy that there was nothing there and they sent him back to bed. The next night, Jimmy heard the noises again. This time they were much louder. Jimmy got the courage to get up and look outside. As he peeked through the curtains, he saw 3 shadowy figures standing in the garden. They were glaring back at him with glowing red eyes. The figures seemed to point at him as they moved closer to his window. Jimmy rushed into his parents' room and woke them up. He told them about the figures outside, but when they got up to look, the figures were nowhere to be seen. His parents told him that he must have been dreaming, and he reluctantly went back to bed. The next night, he heard the noises outside of his window again. When he turned over in bed, he was horrified to see a bony, skeletal face staring at him through the window. In one skeletal hand, it held a long, sharp knife. It was scratching at the window with its other hand. Trembling with fear, Jimmy quickly put his head under the covers. When the scratching finally stopped, Jimmy jumped out of bed and cautiously peeked out through the curtains. The 3 figures had disappeared. Instead, where the 3 figures stood, there appeared to be 3 freshly dug holes in the garden. The next morning, Jimmy's parents decided to call the police and try to make sense of what had happened the night before. The police informed them that years before, 3 psychopaths had escaped from a local insane asylum. They had gone on a rampage, killing anyone they came across and terrorizing the whole town. The previous owner of the house had caught the crazed psychopaths trying to break into his house through the bedroom window. He killed all 3 of them and buried their bodies in the garden. The police began an investigation, called on a company to rent heavy machinery, dug up the garden, and found that there were 3 bodies still buried there. There was a young boy who was afraid of the dark. Every night he would leave the lights on when he went to sleep. After a while, his parents got tired of this and told him he would have to grow up. But the boy continued sleeping with the lights on. So on their way to bed, his parents would come into his room while he was asleep and switch off the lights. This went on for months. One weekend, his parents went on holiday and they left him home alone for a whole week. He took out a book and read a scary story in bed, but the lights were on, so he didn't get too scared. And when he went to sleep that night with the lights on, he didn't get too scared. But in the middle of the night, he woke up to find that someone had switched off the lights. That's when he began to get scared. This family moved into an old house that had been vacant for a few years. After they had been living in the house for a few weeks, they began to smell some strange odor in one of the bedrooms. One night, when they were watching TV, they saw a documentary about a father who had murdered his 13-year-old stepdaughter, chopped her into pieces, and hidden her body parts in the walls of his house. At the end of the documentary, it showed the address of the murder house. It was the very same address as the house that they had moved into. The creepiest thing is that the police found all of the girl's body parts, except for her head. We live in the house next door to you. We seem like a normal family. During the day, we go to work, we go to school, we wave hello as we pass you in the street. But at night, when you go to bed, we lock our doors, we close our curtains, we peel off our skin and sit around in our shiny white bones. If you sleep alone at night, you should never sleep in a double bed. If you do, You should never just sleep on one side of the double bed. There's a legend that goes like this. In the dark of night, while you're sleeping on one side of the double bed, you'll sense the presence of something or someone creeping into your room. The first night that this happens, the thing will just lie down on the floor next to your bed, and you'll hear its deep breathing. The next night, it will lie down next to you on the bed. You'll hear the deep breathing right next to your ear, and you'll feel its breath on your neck. If you allow this to continue for another night, you'll be woken in the middle of the night, and your bed will be shaking. Then the mattress will start bouncing up and down because the thing will be moving, trying to climb on top of you. Whatever you do, don't let it know that you're not asleep. Thank you all again for sticking around with us and enjoying another volume of creepy short stories. We hope that you've locked your doors and made sure everything is safe around your house before you go to bed. Good luck to you. Sweet dreams.